Hello, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon for our annual Art School and Career Panel Series. Our three panelists, who I will introduce momentarily, will be asked a series of questions about art history programs and opportunities in the field post-graduation. After the panelists have finished discussing, we will open it up to a Q&A session with students, parents, and teachers. Before I introduce our panelists, I have a few notes. Upon entering this Zoom webinar, you will have been muted and your camera turned off. Due to the nature of a webinar program, these features will remain disabled for the duration of the event. During the presentation, we encourage you to type any questions you might have for the speakers into the chat or Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. At the end of the talk, we will open up these questions up to be answered by our panelists. You can also use the raised hand feature, and we can call on you to unmute yourself and ask your question directly. This event will be recorded. If you would not like to be included in the recording, but wish to listen to the talk, simply keep your microphone turned off for the duration of the event. So now I'm going to introduce our three panelists. First, we have Danielle Osteen, who is an art historian and curator based in Philadelphia. She was the inaugural curator at the Krieger Museum in Washington, D.C., where she is currently curating the exhibition Lou Stovall on Inventions and Color to open in January 2022. Osteen has held fellowship positions at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and the Hirshhorn Museum in Sculpture Garden, and worked in the curatorial departments at the Phillips Collection, the National Portrait Gallery, and the Baltimore Museum of Art. She holds a PhD in art history from the University of Maryland. Next is Elizabeth Denholm, who is a collections care professional committed to the physical care, digital record keeping, and public interpretation of art and cultural heritage. Formerly the manager of a significant private collection of modern and contemporary art in Washington, D.C., and a registrar at the Delaware Art Museum, she is experienced in collections management and registration with a focus on managing permanent collections, outgoing loan programs, and traveling exhibitions, objects care, conditions assessment, and has technician-level object conservation skills. She holds an MA in art history from George Mason University and couples collections care experience with a strong foundation in historical research and interpretive writing. She has conducted research and produced writing for online exhibitions and created collections-related social media content. Her academic background and professional expertise informs her passion for creating deeper connections between people and collections through publications and interactive digital platforms such as searchable online collections and online exhibitions. And last, we have Robert DiCaroli, who is a professor of art history at George Mason University. Dr. DiCaroli's research concentrates on the early history and development of Buddhist art. In his first book, Haunting the Buddha, Indian Popular Religions and the Formation of Buddhism, Oxford University Press in 2004, he connects the early success of Buddhism to its interaction with local spirit cults. His second book, Image Problems, The Origin and Development of the Buddha's Image in Early South Asia, University of Washington Press in 2015, explores the emergence of figural imagery in the earliest Buddhist traditions of South Asia. He is also the author of numerous articles, book chapters, and catalog essays. Dr. DiCaroli recently co-curated an exhibition, Encountering the Buddha, Art and Practice Across Asia, at the Sackler Gallery of the Smithsonian Institution. So those are our three wonderful panelists today, and we're going to start our panel off by asking them some questions just to get to know what they do. So my first question for you guys is, what does a typical day in your profession look like? And if any of you want to just jump right in and start, feel free.
I could start.
Perfect.
Thanks so much for having us. I'm delighted to be joining everyone in this virtual space, although I have to say I can't wait to get back to being in person. I really miss all of the before and after conversations, getting to know everyone. So I would say that administrative work is more of a majority of my work than I think most people think, in terms of corresponding with artists, corresponding with lenders, with all of my installation crew at the Krieger Museum, where I'm still working as an exhibition curator, it's really just kind of having constant conversations with all the different people who help put an exhibition together. In a way, I think of it, it's almost like being a film director of a film where you're only, there's a team of people who are actually really making it work, and it's making sure that everyone has what they need, and that and everyone, is talking to one another. And so I would say more of my day-to-day is really having those conversations than the content side, which is usually kind of the beginning of an exhibition development. And I would think it's the most fun because it's when I really get to research and develop content for my exhibitions. But it's a small section of the work. It's, there's kind of, I would say there's a flow to an exhibition that really starts with concept and research and then gets into the realities of execution, which is its own fun juggling act.
Thank you. Robert, did you want to pick up with
Sure.
yours?
So I think the day looks very different depending where you are in your career as in the education, and also what time of year it is. Because as you can imagine, when school is in session, our day looks quite different than over the summer break when we're largely engaged in research. I should say from the outset that most universities have pretty strict research requirements of their faculty. So you do kind of have this, I quite like it, this nice shift between really intense moments of activity with students and in the classroom, prepping for classes, doing committee work. Like Danielle, there's a lot more committee work than you would think, a lot of departmental level and university level committees that need to be, that one participates in. But then once that's done and the summer break starts, or even over winter break, or in any spare moment that you can squeeze it in, then you're pursuing your own research. And so you're trying to be productive. And frankly, I don't know any of my colleagues at any moment who don't owe someone an article or are prepping for a paper or who are trying to get something to a publisher, because that's just part of the cycle of working in academics.
Great, thank you. And Elizabeth?
Yeah, I would say, similarly, being in collections care or a registrarial position, the day-to-day varies depending on the institution, where you are in your career, and what type of position you're in. So there are some registrars that focus just on outgoing loans, for example. So I like collections work because I've always considered it sort of the jack of all trades position, where you have, really intense administrative work, whether you're coordinating loans, acquisitions, working with other institutions. But then you also have a lot of hands-on experience with the objects themselves. So conducting conditions assessments, helping out in the galleries with installations, and working with art handlers and conservators. So it really is a huge breadth of work, which I really enjoy.
Great, thank you guys. So my next question is, how did you arrive at this point in your career? Are there specific internships, fellowships, or apprenticeships that students with similar interests should seek?
I can kick that one off. I actually landed in the collections field sort of on accident. I always knew I wanted to work in museums, in an art space. Obviously, my degrees are in art history. My first job after my undergraduate was working with a private collector. And so that really got me interested in museum collections and working with objects. And I would say that a lot of people don't really know about like the registrar or collections management aspect of museum work while they're in school. It's, at least for me, it wasn't always presented as an option. So it was something totally new. So I really love being able to talk about it with current students or people that are interested in art history, and sort of giving that as an option to explore, before they get out into the job force.
Yeah, we're happy because that's exactly what we want you here to do today.
So if we're doing this in reverse order, I guess I'll go next. When I was in school, internships weren't very common, although I did get a job as a research assistant with a professor. And I have to say that being able to shadow her in her day-to-day activities was incredibly formative and useful. Like it helped solidify that this is something I wanted to do. And so I think internships are really crucial at potentially two moments. One is when you're first starting out, just to make sure that that the job is actually what you think it is, and that what you might imagine as a glamorous career actually has, grunt work associated with it, and to sort of get a sense of what the workplace is like. And then at the end of your time as a student, potentially to get your foot in the door as a way to maybe open up opportunity. We've had a lot of students who have been able to turn internships into career opportunities. And so I think, at the beginning or at the end, I think in either case, those kinds of encounters can be really useful.
I'm going to second the idea that I've always told people it's as much about, maybe even more about what you don't want to do and versus what you do want to do, because checking something off your list of, wow, I really wasn't interested in that work, that really didn't suit me, I feel like is really helpful when you're coming out of a degree, whether it's undergrad or graduate. My route was not a direct one, in that I didn't start out of undergrad going straight through to grad school or to museum work. I worked in arts publishing in an art magazine as an editor for years in New York, and then decided to completely shift paths and go to graduate school. And while I did my master's at GW and I did my PhD at University of Maryland, but while I was at GW, they offered credit for internships. So I was able to intern at museums during the semester and get credit for it and not have it overwhelm my workload. And I did an internship as often as I could. And so I at some point worked with everybody in DC, either as an intern or a fellow, just to get, as Robert was saying, to kind of test out the environment and see what was a good fit. And I found it really helpful. Of course, it drove me to continue graduate school because I felt like I wasn't finished after my master's, and it's a certain kind of affliction that I guess you develop at a certain point. You have to keep going. But that experience of interning and then later working as a fellow at some area institutions in DC was completely important to me, because I didn't get that training in school. No one was showing me how to curate an exhibition or how to work with an artist. I was taking internships, and I was working independently in DC with anybody who would have me. So nonprofit spaces or smaller galleries. I curated a couple exhibitions with, contemporary artists that I had become friendly with. And I think everything about curating is learning by doing. I'm envious of people who are in programs that actually teach them those skills. They're very few, but for me, it was all on the ground and making a lot of mistakes and feeling totally out of my element and for the first handful of shows. And but the thing is, if you love it after that, then you can stick with it. So I think it's a good test to kind of jump into in that way too.
Thank you. That sounds really helpful, just to learn by doing rather than learning all of you need to know in the classroom, trying to finish the degree that you're working on. What sparked your interest in art history?
I don't mean to do like a forward and backwards pattern.
Either way.
If that's how it works.
I did my undergrad at Colby College in Maine, which now is its own art center, but at the time, this was 100 years ago, was not it didn't have the arts scene that it does now. And I thought I would be interested in art history, so I took the 101 Western Art Survey, and I became completely enamored with my survey. It was two professors who were kind of doing it together, and they loved it so much, and I just completely fell in love. I mean, it was one of those I got knocked over by it, and I was completely smitten. And I'm still close with one of those professors because it was so formative to me. And I feel like I hear that a lot, that people are there's some kind of love connection that happens. Certainly not, a practical connection maybe initially, but there's something that really, that grabs you. And that it was really that first Western art seminar. And for anyone who's taken a art history seminar, they're not easy. So you really do have to want to stick with it after that. It's like a good initiation.
And I'll just say I find it hard not to like, right? I mean, I think what's amazing about art history is that it's a it's like the lure, because the art is so beautiful and so intriguing, and it introduces so many questions. I mean, and who doesn't like looking at these great objects? They have tremendous visual appeal. And then once you're drawn in by the aesthetics, then you get to the history of it, or you get to the significance of it. And if you really want to understand what that statue or that mask or whatever it happens to be means, then you find yourself, looking further and further and further into the past, or into different cultures, or into different moments in time, different individuals. And I feel like that's hard not to like. And I mean, like Danielle, I had some amazingly gifted teachers, particularly at the university level. I had no idea what art history was when I was an undergraduate. I had never encountered it before. It was an option for an arts requirement, and I took it, and I immediately declared a minor, and then it went from there into becoming what I was focusing on primarily.
Thanks. So I actually started out with my interest in studio art. In sort of high school age, I was thinking like, okay, what do I want my college majors to be? And I really wanted to do studio art, but I had an amazing high school history teacher who always incorporated art history into his lessons at some point. And that really was kind of the shift for me, and thinking like, well, maybe I don't want to make art every day for a living, but I would rather, like talk about art, learn about art, share with other people. So that's sort of when that shifted for me.
Great, thank you. My next question is, what level of education is necessary for your area of work? Are there any specialties or certifications required? Let's mix it up, and let's start with Danielle this time.
It's such a hard question to answer because I think so. I mean, I have a PhD. I certainly don't think that you have to work in curatorial work to have a PhD or a master's. I think that there's a professionalization of that degree that's been happening where it's becoming more and more common that PhD is a minimum level for certain positions. I do think people have been able to build experience without needing those degrees. That being said, I think that I would never in a million years tell everybody that they have to go get a PhD to do museum work. I think it really is almost a completely personal choice. And if for me personally, I found that there was certain research fields that I wanted to explore that I had to satisfy kind of an itch of filling in history that hadn't been written yet. And that was a big part of why I continued. But then what I found in applying those skills as a professional now is that it's easier for me to dive into deep research more quickly than I was able to before my PhD. So I do find that there are certain tools that are very helpful because you're not doing the same level as an academic professor, of course, but you know what it looks like to need that kind of level. If you're writing a catalog essay and you want it to have an impact. So I do feel like for me, it's very helpful to apply those skills that I just didn't have until I was writing a dissertation. But I think there's so many ways to get to the point of working as a curator that it's only if those things all align that you feel like you have that itch and you're supported by your institution. I mean, I think for most people that's a foregone conclusion, but not for everybody. And I was supported by both GW and Maryland because I was teaching all the way through. And so I was able to be a student, be supported, not have to worry about coming out the other end with a ton of loans. And I think that's another really important thing to keep in mind when you're wondering how far to go.
Thank you. Robert, did you want to pick it there?
Honestly, I would just agree with just about everything Danielle said. I think that the expectation for most university research professor jobs is that you have a PhD, but I think there's other ways to get into education, in art history education without that, both through museum education and through colleges, and depending where you are in the country. There are other opportunities that exist, but it's the kind of thing where it can be a struggle because there's often more people applying than there are jobs. And so I think that's what causes a kind of expectation of credentialing and that sort of thing that creeps up. But having done the PhD, I can say it was useful. And I'll also repeat what she said, and so, which is, don't go to one if you're not supported by it. I feel like that's really important. If you come out of a university with a PhD, you're basically marketing for them for the rest of your life, because you represent them and they benefit from that. And so and plus you're going to be teaching and doing other things while you're getting your PhD. So if that's something you want to decide to do, you should make the decision very carefully and weighing all the consequences. I encounter students who sometimes will climb the steps just because they're there, and they don't necessarily think about what the end goal is, like what is the career that they're interested in. And if it's vital for you, then yeah, maybe you should. But if it's not, then really think about it, whether it's worth your time and your money and your effort to do that. But anyway, so that's usually for education. And again, there's all different levels of education for art history as well. So
I completely agree. I think that's some of the best advice I ever got as an undergrad from an advisor is don't go on to grad school unless you're absolutely sure that you know what you want to do. So take that time. So for me, it was really important to start working right after my undergrad and figure out, is this the field that I want to be in? If I can get a job in that field. And after a few years of working, I ultimately ended up deciding to go back to grad school. And it was a good decision because I sort of had better perspective at that point. And most people in the collections field do not have a PhD. They don't have a master's. Most have just a bachelor's degree, and not necessarily in art history, honestly. Some have been history, even political science. There are a lot of sort of things that sort of get into this job sphere. I will say having a master's in art history has helped me in my career because I work particularly in art museums. And if you're in a smaller institution, you might have opportunities to work across departments a little bit. So I was able to do some interpretive writing about objects in our collection and that sort of thing. So having that art history background was very valuable for me, and will continue to be.
Thank you, guys. My next question is, what does the application process entail for art history programs, whether that be a bachelor's, master's, or PhD?
I'll take a shot at this one. I think at the BA level, it looks very much like it would for any other student in the humanities, where a lot of emphasis is going to be placed on your writing. And a lot of emphasis will be placed on the kinds of coursework that you've taken. I'm better informed about the MA level because I'm actually on a graduate committee for art history of admissions. And so I can say that in those cases, what we look for are generally three things, the most important of which is the quality of writing. If you have a very good writing sample, if you're able to form an argument, that's really important. The second thing we look for is that you've taken a fair number of art history courses and in a variety of subject areas. So if you have the equivalent of a minor in art history, you're good to go. If it's less than that, then there might be concern expressed over whether or not you're fully prepared, or whether you've had enough exposure to art history at the undergraduate level to do graduate level work. And then thirdly, it's the other kinds of factors that come in. Our program, for instance, has a language requirement. And so something that I think undergraduates don't think about when they're going into art history is that it could be really useful to do some foreign language work, because a lot of art history depends on being able to read languages other than just English. So I think those three things I would keep in mind when applying to the graduate level.
What I would add, I have never served on a admissions committee. I've only heard stories, but I would say from an applicant standpoint, I was very proactive when I was applying for both my graduate degrees, in meeting with advisors beforehand, I really think of it like matchmaking. You want to work with them, they want to work with you, they'll be an advocate for you in the admissions process if it's a good match. And that was really where, and I only really sought out the advisors that I was the most excited about, which was also kind of a telling exercise in where you want to land. It's not necessarily the institution, sometimes it's the person specifically who is maybe a little different than kind of the general vibe of the department. So I really think having a personal connection, even like reaching out over email and asking for a meeting, which, is a formal interview kind of in disguise, because of course you have to put your best foot forward. But again, it's to make sure that your research interests align. I think that's incredibly helpful in the process. And then also talking to students and seeing how happy they are. Because, they're every department or institution or, in the world has problems somewhere. There's some personality that you're navigating. I mean, it's just the nature of working in the world. And being an academic department is no different in making sure that the students are being supported, that they're finding what they need, that they're happy in their research. I think that, and it's just a matter of asking the department administrative person for some emails. I think that's really a helpful step too.
Yeah, I want to reiterate what Danielle said, in that meeting with professors and advisors in programs was really helpful for me, as well as current students and alumni, just to get a better sense of the program, to figure out if it was a good fit. I also think it's very reasonable when considering a graduate program how it might fit into your current lifestyle needs. So for example, for me, it was really important financially that I keep working while I was in school. So I wanted to be able to find a program where I could balance both of those things. And that's not always possible. I had actually found a few programs that I thought I was interested in, and they essentially were like, well, we recommend that you don't work at all. So, it really sort of depends what your needs are.
Can I just add to what Elizabeth just said? Because I think both she and Danielle raised an important point, which was talking to your advisors. As you're going into college at any level, I would encourage you to take time to meet with your professors. You're not imposing on them. It is part of our job. And so do that. It can be a really core part of your education. And it's one of the benefits of working directly with people who know the field. So even if you're shy about such things, try to get over it and do try to meet with your professors. Anyway, I'll just put that out there.
Thank you for those comments. It sounds like not every program is created equal, and it's important to kind of make sure you know what you want as well. My next question is, how important is it to establish a specific area of study or interest as a student, whether that be a time period, medium, culture, or region?
I think it so depends on the level of academic work. When I was an undergrad, so I was a sculpture student and an art history major. And so I had an interest in contemporary art and sculpture early on because it was part of my own practice. And so there were certain things that I was drawn to, but as an undergrad, I really kind of, like, my favorite professor did Greek art. I mean, and I'm an Americanist now. So, I think it's more like getting the enthusiasm when you're an undergrad and kind of trying everything, gleaning like what's going to grab you. I really didn't have a specialty coming out of that program. I just had things that I was excited about. And then it got further refined as I went through. So by the time you're applying for a master's program, you really are pitching your master's thesis. You're pitching what the work is that you're going to do, and that will completely shift for most people. But you do have to have some sense going in, because you're working with an advisor and you're there has to be that connection. And then by the time you get to the PhD level, you're pitching your dissertation and you basically stick, most people stick to that for the most part. So I think it's better to be as open as you can for as long as you can, because it allows you to be exposed to as much as, the further up the academic ladder you get, the less you're exposed to in a certain sense as a student. So it's better to be as open as you can at the beginning.
Yeah, I think part of the reason I have not done my PhD yet is because I have a hard time choosing like a very, very specific thing I want to focus on. I want to do everything. I want to learn about everything, write about everything. So for me, being a registrar in the collections care field is great because being a generalist can be really helpful. So, encountering all types of artwork, artifacts, and just having some knowledge like that breadth, I think is really great. That being said, obviously everyone is interested a little bit more in like a particular area, and that's helpful too, but it doesn't mean I don't like learning about everything else. So master's programs, you can find more generalist programs, which are really great. And you can sort of hone your expertise in a thesis, but you can always have a job in the field that allows you to be a bit more of a generalist.
Yeah, I'm just going to be repeating what they said, but I will say that I think there's also a tactical advantage for staying general early in your education. One is because you might not know the field that you love yet until you take that class. The other thing too is that if you want to go into teaching, if you hyper specialize, then when the opportunities come out for teaching a course, you might not have the expertise that's necessary to teach that course. So, if you're just doing something very narrow, but they want a survey of Asia or a survey of Latin America, you have to take enough coursework so that you have a bit of that breadth and that comfort level to be able to actually teach a wide range of subjects. Even if it's not your research specialty, there's, I think, some expectation that you should at least be fluent in the material and be able to be comfortable teaching that subject. And so if you keep your options open for a while, and again, even into the MA, I think you should begin to think about specializing, but I think it's okay to still, maybe you want to work in, I don't know, Europe. So you take your courses broadly in Europe, but then you're eventually going to focus on medieval or, I don't know, Carolingian funerary art or something, but that you can get more and more focused as you go up in your training. Because very few institutions are going to ever offer a course on exactly what your dissertation topic was. So I think it's smart to keep those options open.
One thing I just wanted to add to that also is that similar to like a professor who's pressed to teach courses that were not part of their research, but they adapt in these different ways. As soon as you're working in a museum, in a collection, you have to adapt to what's in the collection. So there are things that, like, starting at the Krieger Museum, we have a really impressive collection of African art. And I took one course in African art as a graduate student, but it's traditional. It's not even contemporary, which was more of my focus. And I had to do the research to learn that work. And I think learning how to be flexible and to be kind of interested in everything, right? To exercise those generalist skills, I think will only help you when you're actually in the working world.
Great, thank you guys. The next question is, how can art history studies be useful for other fields of work? Studio art, history, teaching, archaeology, religious studies, political science, just anything that you can think of where your knowledge of art history can be applied elsewhere.
Well, I think just what Danielle said is utilizing those research skills is huge. And I know it's been said earlier, but the importance of writing, I think, is key, throughout every field. Even if you are just communicating with your work department in an email or in formal letters, just having that writing experience and communication is so important. So
I'll second and third it and say over and over, writing. I think when I was teaching at University of Maryland as a graduate student, I don't know if this is still true, but whenever I would be teaching seminar, which was attached to like our big 200-person lecture classes, we would start for at least a week or two of talking about writing and kind of honing writing skills for students that were taking their art history class for the first time, that were maybe even freshmen. And a lot of it was also reinforcing, like, these are skills that you're going to learn in this class. I mean, the history is bonus, of course. I mean, that's the meat for us, but in terms of developing those critical thinking skills and analysis skills, that can be applied really anywhere. And I just don't think there are quite as many fields where you can cross over all these different, history, visual culture, writing, creative thinking. This is the sales pitch that we would give our undergraduates to keep, to bring them in. And I really do believe in it.
I'll just build off that and say that I think art history lives at this very interesting crossroads of lots of different disciplines. And you can talk to a group of art historians and find that their research and who they speak to in their research and who reads their research is quite different. So, I mean, if you're a contemporary art critic, you're doing a very different kind of work than somebody who's working in ancient periods and is working alongside archaeologists, right? Or somebody else who's working with living artists and actually does interviews in a way that might be more like the way a journalist would. And so I think that that malleability in the field keeps it pretty dynamic, and it allows you to sort of decide, well, who do you want as your neighbors? I mean, for me, honestly, I think probably more people in religious studies read my research than people in art history. And I think that's just because of where I've situated myself in terms of my own research. And so I think it's up to the individual who they decide they want to pull up next to and whose work they want to read and be in dialogue with. And I think art history allows you to do that more easily than most fields.
Great, thank you. And I have one more question for our discussion portion of this panel. And that is, how do you stay up to date with advances in research and findings in your area of study? Any recommendations for continued professional development?
I don't mind starting this one off. I'll just say that it used to be really important to visit like the periodical sections of the library, but I think those days have long passed. There are sites now that like academia.com and researchgate.net and others, which have become kind of almost a social media platform for people to announce that they've written something new, or that when they publish something, they'll put up the bibliographic reference. And so if there's scholars that you've been studying or people that you've been working with, that's a way to keep up with what's new in your specific field, assuming you're staying in that area. If you're moving into a new area, then I think that poses different kinds of problems, but it's ones that be friendly to your research librarians because they can be very helpful in keeping up with things.
Thankfully, those walls of publications still exist in places. It's just not, they're far, far afield. I'm going to make a pitch for the SAM library, the Sam and Portrait Gallery Library. They have a great wall of publications, and it's free to go in and use their library. I think I don't know even know if they've reopened. I would say that for me, it's, there's certain things that I have to catch up on if I'm working on a publication that's related to my dissertation, where, it's been a couple of years since I've written it. And of course, in that many years, things have been published, and it's kind of hunting things down and seeing what's out there using JSTOR or other academic search engines. In terms of professionally, I'd say it's really more attending events, going to like lunch bags. I follow a bunch of different academic groups that have these kind of lunch bag talks regularly, or young scholar fellowship talks, things that are showcasing younger scholars, but then also scholars who are in the middle of a project that they want to workshop. And I try to attend those things as much as I can. DC is a great place for those resources, which I'm sad to have left. I'm trying to learn the Philadelphia lunch bag scene, but for now, everything's on Zoom. So I was able to keep up with most of it this past year and some. But I think it's helpful to hear people talk about what they're working on and even, attending lectures with museum professionals or contemporary artists that are working with museums to get a sense of how museum practice is changing, and because it's changing a lot right now, as it should, and there's a lot of discussion about that. So I kind of try to listen to as much as I can, and I find that to be a good kind of regular routine that's a little different than reading, of course, but it brings some of that engagement virtually to me.
Yeah, I think just building off of that, in addition to attending programs and keeping up to date on research, joining professional organizations can be very, very helpful. And oftentimes these organizations also have student level memberships. So, if you are a student and you think you might be interested in a particular field, you can join at a student level and sort of get in on those events, be able to network with people. And oftentimes they have mentorship programs built into those organizations too. So I think that's a great way, if you're an early career professional or just starting out, to sort of get your foot in the door and meet people. But it continues to be beneficial because there are conferences, workshops, webinars to attend, and continued networking too. I just moved across the country. So for me, being a part of a national professional organization gave me the ability to reach out to people in my new area and sort of connect with that community elsewhere. So I really recommend that.
Great, thank you guys. So that is the end of the discussion questions prepared, but I do have some follow-up questions for you guys from this discussion. And my first question is, do you consider this to be a competitive field or fairly easy to enter from the bachelor's degree level?
I would say that it's probably dependent on region. In my experience, the DC area is incredibly competitive, particularly in the field. Obviously, there are world-class institutions there. And so you're competing with everyone in that area and also across the country who want to work there, want to get internships there. So, I think it varies regionally, but try not to get discouraged by the amount of competition, because I will say that in the field of art history, I think it's a particularly collegial environment too. So those networking relationships with other professionals are really helpful in a job search.
I would definitely second the idea of networking kind of being integral to putting your best foot forward and to being more visible in a pool of applicants. That might be very intimidating as a young person, as an undergrad. And this gets back to what Robert was saying about really just going to office hours with your professor and having a conversation and saying, I'm interested in museum work, or I'm interested in teaching or in being, doing education work in a museum. And they will most likely have a colleague that they can email and have you talk to them. I think the world is very small in art history when it comes down to it. And it really does make a difference to show up and to express an interest. It's really that simple. And I know it's intimidating. And it doesn't have to start as some ambitious networking, sending emails to 100 people and chasing them down. It can be as simple as reaching out to someone you have that connection with already and asking for a little help. But again, showing your interest, I'm really interested in this. I was struck by this in your lecture and I want to learn more, or whatever it ends up being. I think those small steps really help.
Yeah, and I would say, look at the courses being offered by your program. A good program, a good university will recognize the needs of the job market and will offer courses on it. I think, like Danielle said earlier, they should have courses that allow you to take internships for credit. We, for instance, at George Mason recently started regularly offering a curating an exhibit seminar because we recognized people weren't getting that training on how to curate a seminar and curate an exhibit. And so there's ways in which you can talk to your advisors and look at the actual structure of the program to see if it's training you in the skills that you think you're going to need when you go out there, or the skills that your advisors are telling you you'll need. Because it shouldn't be a challenge to get that training if you're at the right place.
Thank you. My next question, let me read. Are there any other specific skills one should have in starting a career in art history, aside from writing, analytic skills, and knowledge of art history? Kind of playing off of what you guys were just talking about, any skills that you wish you had that you've developed that are necessary for your field of work?
I'm just going to say it again, even though people don't want to hear it, language training, including foreign language training. A lot of research, if you have an inkling about what part of the world you want to study or what time period, that's going to change the kinds of language training that you're going to need. And sometimes it's a really good idea to start early on that because it's often a hurdle for students. But it can really mean the difference between getting into a good grad school and not. Because frequently, if you show up with the training in hand, you're far more desirable as a student than somebody who's just starting out studying their foreign language.
I would say oftentimes this might be something that you learn once you start your career, but I think it can be sort of led up to as like project management skills. And you're either going to be on deadlines for yourself or with the team. So I think it's really important to be able to take a project, look at the big picture, and then sort of break down the steps that it takes to get there. So whether that's through research and writing, planning an exhibition, or planning outgoing loans or acquisitions of new artwork for a museum. I think kind of having that perspective of project management is important.
I'm just going to say writing again, because I think writing is all about practice. It really is. And your writing is only going to get, there's no way that your writing is going to be at the same level as a professor who's been literally practicing for however many years. When I was an undergrad and I was an art history major, and I at some point realized I wanted to be in arts publishing, but I didn't have any writing experience. And I just pitched to our school paper and asked them if I could write exhibition reviews. And they are the worst things you've ever read. And they published them in print, but they let me be like the exhibition reviewer for the student shows, for the museum shows at Colby. And it was kind of like the first step in actually flexing those muscles and figuring out where I needed to do better. But I think, finding those kinds of ways to practice writing, I think are really helpful. And then the only other thing I thought of was just kind of honing your professionalism skills too. I think that people, especially when they're coming through from undergrad straight to grad programs, they maybe don't treat their professors like, I don't want to say like they're their bosses, but there's more of a kind of buddy vibe going on among them and their professors. And I think that if you're coming in with a clear, interest in being professional and being respectful and writing your emails respectfully, and I think that goes a long way in showing your seriousness in the field. And this is true for everything you do coming out of high school, coming out of college. But I think it's also true when you're going into grad school. Grad school doesn't kind of isn't exempt from that professionalism. I think it's kind of forgotten that it's such a great skill to practice constantly.
I actually thought of one more thing, and that's public speaking experience. A lot of careers in art history require a certain amount of public speaking. Teaching certainly does. And the more you do it, the more you get over it. I was very nervous when I started out teaching. And I think having had more experience or more training in it would have made that transition easier from being just a student in the classroom to being somebody in front of the classroom. So I'd say seek out those opportunities, even if they're uncomfortable.
Yeah, I will say a good graduate program or undergrad program will force you to do it. I know Dr. DeCaroli did for us, and it was so helpful. Yeah.
Thank you for your comments. Two more questions. Can you talk a little bit about the work environments you each worked in pre-COVID, the hours, team size, and types, those types of things?
So I can jump in. So I pre-COVID, I had actually just started my position at the Krieger, and it's a very small staff. It's a staff of about 8 people. And it's a very much like an all hands on deck kind of team environment, in that everybody has their own departments and responsibilities that they're managing on their own. But then if there's something that people need, it was a very collaborative environment. The Krieger itself was built from the residents of the collectors who built the collection. And so, our offices were in the former bedrooms. And I mean, there's all of these interesting aspects of that environment that allowed it to be very collaborative, because we were kind of all sharing the space together. I miss that, I have to say, because COVID really changed all of that. And then I moved, so I made it more complicated, and now I'm project-based for them. But I think that my anecdote about that environment is that, there's all these different versions of a museum environment. There's the monster big museum where everyone's kind of in their siloed department, and they're not necessarily collaborative, and things move very slowly, but they're very impressive and well supported. There's like a mid kind of size museum that has good resources, but the staff isn't terribly big and people can kind of still collaborate. And then there's the small museum like the Krieger, where you can be more nimble, you can change things very quickly, you can develop exhibitions, more efficiently. It's not quite the same big machine, and you can also take on more responsibility, and in a good way. You can kind of build your experience more, I'd say, more organically than at a bigger institution. So for me, being an intern, being a fellow, was testing out these different sizes and figuring out what did I want? And the really big encyclopedic monster museum was really not right for me at the time. So it was helpful in kind of narrowing down that type of environment.
I can go. I'll just say that I'm in a very large department of history and art history in one. Within that faculty of, I think, somewhere over 30 faculty members, 6 are tenure line art history people, and we form a program within that larger unit. We also have 3 teaching faculty who are full-time and teach with us as well. There's the schedule of the hours can be really can fluctuate wildly. Because it's the way we have a lot of control over when we do our work, because aside from when we have to be at certain meetings or when we have to teach our classes, the rest of the time is quite flexible. But there are safeguards in place that the university has to assure that we maintain a certain level of research productivity. And so if you can't put off the work forever, because you've got to get those things published and you have to get those things done. And if you don't, it can impact your salary, or if you're early in your career, it can cost you your job. So there are certain structural benchmarks that you have to be aware of, but there's an awful lot of personal flexibility in terms of how you apportion your time within that. So yeah, and in terms of the spaces, ours is a large department, but we also have this smaller art history unit within it. And so I feel like we benefit both from that close congeniality of a small group, but also all of the nice political leverage that you get from being in a large department. And so there's benefits to both.
Similar to Danielle, I started a position right before COVID, so that was very interesting. I was the associate registrar at the Delaware Art Museum, which is more of a mid-sized museum, small mid-size. We had about 50 employees total. And it was really interesting to sort of learn a new job and learn a collection while not being able to be on site with those objects. But yeah, it was a wonderful position, and for the most part, 9 to 5, and a very supportive staff, also small, collaborated across departments. And also, as Danielle said, being in a smaller institution, you kind of have the opportunity to do more things. So with a department of just 2 registrars, I also did things like manage the rights and reproductions, which in a big institution would be a completely separate department. So there are some opportunities to sort of dabble in other things depending on the size of the institution.
Thank you. We have one more question for you guys before rounding out this program, and that is, do you think the art history field has been and will be changed at all post-pandemic, and continuing to change with COVID?
Yes, entirely. I mean, I don't know where to begin, but in a good way. I mean, it has to. I think it's going to take a while to see how, and a lot of shifts in staff and public facing presences. And I mean, there's a lot of work that has to happen for museums to change, and it's the slowest moving machine imaginable, but absolutely, there's no way things can return to pre-COVID. I believe that firmly.
University, it's very similar. I mean, yes, it's changed a lot. It used to be that they were begging us all to start teaching online courses, and now it's kind of a challenge to get us back in the classroom. I am eager to get back. But I'll also say that it's also provided a degree of access and communication where, for instance, just as a personal anecdote, I do a lot of my work in India, but it's not always economically feasible for institutions in India to fly foreign scholars in to give a lecture. But now it's perfectly acceptable to give a talk in your living room to people in the other part of the world. You might have to get up at an early hour for them to have an evening lecture, time differences and all that. But it's normalized remote conversations in a way that I think will only improve the degree of dialogue that happens globally in our fields. It also means that no matter what you're doing, you're probably missing somebody giving a talk somewhere. So there's a lot of demands on your time if you want to keep up with all of the interesting talks and presentations that are happening.
Yeah, definitely. I think, again, with virtual programming, it's really exciting to be able to attend all those things, but can also be overwhelming because there's just so much. But yeah, I can see that a lot of museums will sort of stick to this virtual programming model. And I think hopefully there would be more visibility for institutions and more opportunities for people to network with one another too.
Thank you all. We have reached the end of our program. I want to thank each of you for joining me in this webinar and giving such helpful and insightful notes on your profession and your education and just art history as a whole. It was incredibly, incredibly interesting.
Thank you for having us.
Yes.
Thank you.